The entire estate goes to Dr. Marcus Webb. The lawyer's voice cracked the silence of my father's study like a gunshot, and I watched my mother's coffee cup slip right out of her hand. Dr. Marcus Webb, my mother's therapist. The man she'd been seeing every Tuesday for 3 years, ever since my father's first heart attack scared all of us. The man who sat across from her in that soft leather chair, listening to her talk about her marriage. That man just inherited my father's entire $40 million wine estate in Napa Valley. Every acre, every bottle, every dollar. I'm Claire, I'm 34, and up until 11 minutes ago, I thought I knew everyone in that room. My 2 brothers. My mother, our family attorney who'd known us since I was in diapers. Now, this stranger's name hung in the air, and nobody could explain why my father left everything to my mother's psychologist instead of his own children. If you're watching this, sit with that for a second. Imagine finding out the person your mother trusted with her deepest pain was quietly being written into your father's will the whole time. Would you have seen it coming? Because I didn't. Not even close. What I found out over the next few weeks made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. Stick with me, because this gets so much darker. And by the end, I need you to tell me honestly, am I in the wrong for what I did next? Let me back up, because you need to understand what our family actually looked like before all of this. My father, Richard, built Whitfield Cellars from nothing. He bought 40 acres of scrubland in Napa Valley back in the 80s, when nobody believed a kid from a working-class family in Sacramento could turn dirt into one of the most respected wine labels in California. He did it anyway. By the time I was in high school, we had tasting rooms, a restaurant partnership, and a waiting list for our reserve releases that stretched 2 years long. My father was proud, stubborn, and generous to a fault. He believed in family, in loyalty, in showing up. My mother, Diane, was the elegant half of the operation. She ran the hospitality side, hosted every gala, remembered every employee's kid's name. On the surface, my parents had the kind of marriage people wrote magazine profiles about. Underneath, though, things had been fraying for years. My father's heart attack 4 years ago changed him. He slowed down, got quiet, started handing off more of the business to my older brother Daniel. My mother, meanwhile, started therapy to deal with what she called anticipatory grief, the fear of losing him before she was ready. That's when Dr. Marcus Webb entered our lives. He came recommended by a family friend, had a beautiful office in downtown Napa, and within a few months my mother swore by him. She'd come home from sessions lighter, calmer, talking about boundaries and processing in ways she never had before. My father actually thanked the man once, at a holiday party, for giving his wife her spark back. None of us thought twice about it. Why would we? My younger brother Ethan and I used to joke that Mom was more excited to see her therapist than she was to see us. We meant it as a harmless joke. God, were we wrong about how unfunny that would turn out to be? My father passed away 7 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, moving fast. He had maybe 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and honestly, our whole family was still in shock, still moving through the fog of funeral arrangements and condolence casseroles when the attorney called to schedule the will reading. I remember exactly what I was wearing that day, a black dress that used to be my go-to for weddings and now felt permanently retired for funerals instead. Daniel sat on one side of my mother, Ethan on the other, and I sat across from them, closest to the attorney's desk. The room smelled like my father, old books and cedar, because this had been his study for 30 years. The attorney, a calm older man named Mr. Halloran, who'd handled our family's affairs since before I was born, cleared his throat and started reading. The house in St. Helena, split between the 3 of us kids, fine. The cars, the personal effects, all standard. Then he got to the winery itself, the vineyards, the brand, the investment accounts, everything that actually mattered, everything that represented my father's entire life's work. The entire estate, including Whitfield Cellars, all associated real property, and all liquid assets, is to be transferred in full to Dr. Marcus Webb. Silence. Actual, ringing silence. My mother's coffee cup hit the Persian rug and nobody moved to pick it up. That has to be a mistake, Daniel said. His voice was steady, but I could see his jaw working, the way it always did right before he lost his temper. Marcus Webb is Mom's therapist. Why would Dad leave him anything, let alone everything? Mr. Halloran looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen from him before. This version of the will was signed 6 weeks before your father passed. It supersedes the previous will, which did leave the estate to the 3 of you and your mother. He paused. I want to be clear. I raised concerns about this update when your father brought it to me. He was firm. He said he had his reasons and that he trusted this decision completely. Reasons, my mother repeated, her voice hollow. What reasons could he possibly have to give everything to my therapist? And that's when Ethan, my quiet, careful younger brother who never says anything without thinking it through 3 times, said the sentence that changed the entire direction of this story. Mom, did you ever tell Dad that Marcus mentioned growing up in Sacramento? Because he told me that once, at your birthday dinner, said his mom raised him alone there. The room went cold in a completely different way. Sacramento, my father's hometown. The place he left behind at 19 to chase the vineyard dream, the place he almost never talked about, except for one thing my mother had mentioned exactly once, years ago, half joking, half not. That before he met her, my father had a relationship in his early 20s that ended badly, and that there might have been a child he never met, a secret he carried like a stone in his chest for decades. Nobody in that room said the word out loud yet, but I think we all felt it land at the same time. I drove straight to Dr. Webb's office that afternoon, no appointment, no plan, just raw need to look this man in the eye. His assistant tried to stop me, but I pushed past her into his office, and he stood up from behind his desk like he'd been expecting me for years. You're Richard's son, I said. Not a question. He didn't flinch. I found out for certain 8 months ago. A DNA test I took out of curiosity turned into the answer to a question I'd been carrying my whole life. His voice was calm, therapist calm, and it made me want to scream. I never told your mother who I was. I couldn't. Not while she was still in active treatment with me. So you just kept counseling her? Kept taking her money, kept sitting there while she cried about her marriage to your father, and you never said a word? I was going to tell her. After your father passed, I wanted to give the family time to grieve first. I laughed. A short, ugly sound that didn't feel like mine. Convenient timing, considering you inherited everything before you ever planned to say a word. He leaned forward, and for the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Something less like grief and more like calculation. Your father found me, Claire, not the other way around. He hired a private investigator 2 years ago, after his first heart attack, when he started thinking about legacy. He reached out to me directly. We met for coffee, then dinner. Then he started coming to my office, alone, without your mother's knowledge, for what he called closure sessions. I have every appointment logged. That detail hit me like a punch to the sternum. My father had been secretly seeing this man, his own hidden son, for 2 years, while the rest of us had no idea. While my mother sat in the waiting room of that same practice, completely unaware that the therapist treating her marital anxiety was also privately meeting with her husband about God knows what. He said he wanted to make things right, Marcus continued. He felt guilty his whole life for walking away from my mother when she got pregnant. He said the winery should have included me from the start. This was his way of correcting a decades-old wrong. By cutting out his other 3 children entirely? By erasing us? That's not how he saw it. I left his office shaking, and the drive home is honestly a blur. What stuck with me though, what I couldn't shake, was the timeline. My father's heart attack was 4 years ago. He allegedly found Marcus 2 years ago. My mother started therapy with Marcus 3 years ago. The math didn't sit right, and something in my gut told me there was a piece missing, something none of us had been told. That night, I sat down with my mother and asked her, gently as I could, to walk me through exactly how she chose Dr. Webb as her therapist 3 years ago. Who recommended him? She thought about it for a long moment, and then her face went pale in a way I'll never forget. Your father recommended him, she said slowly, like she was hearing it for the first time herself. He said a colleague's wife had seen him and loved him. He practically insisted I book a consultation. My father had steered my mother into therapy with his own secret son, a full year before Marcus claimed they'd even met. Someone in this story was lying, and I intended to find out exactly who and exactly how far the lie went. Over the next 10 days, I turned into someone I barely recognized. Obsessive, sleepless, digging through every drawer in my father's study, every old email account, every financial statement Daniel could pull from the winery's records. What I found didn't just confirm my suspicion. It blew the entire story wide open. Buried in an old email folder my father had labeled, almost mockingly, wine orders, I found a 4-year correspondence between him and a private investigator, dated back to right after his first heart attack. The investigator had located Marcus within 3 months. My father hadn't waited 2 years to make contact. He'd found him almost immediately, and he'd been in direct communication with him ever since, coaching him, in Marcus's own words from one recovered email, on how to build trust with Diane before the timing is right. My father hadn't just found a son he'd walked away from. He had orchestrated an entire plan, using his own wife's grief and vulnerability as the doorway to bring that son into our lives without any of us knowing the truth. And Marcus Webb had gone along with every step of it, using his therapy license, his ethics, his entire profession, as a weapon against a grieving family who trusted him. The final piece came from Daniel, who found something even worse buried in the winery's legal file. 6 weeks before my father died, the same week the new will was signed, Marcus had personally driven my father to Mr. Halloran's office, alone. No family present. My father, by that point, was on heavy pain medication around the clock, barely lucid some days, according to the hospice notes Daniel also found. And Mr. Halloran's own file notes, which he was legally required to keep, documented that he'd raised concerns about my father's capacity to make major decisions that day, concerns that Marcus, sitting right there in the room, had smoothly talked past. I sat with all of it spread across my father's desk, the emails, the hospice records, the attorney's notes, and I understood exactly what had happened to my family. A man had spent years quietly infiltrating our lives through the person we trusted to be most vulnerable in front of him. And, in the final weeks of my father's life, when he was weakest and most susceptible, that man had walked him into a lawyer's office and walked out with everything we'd ever known. The question wasn't whether my father had a right to acknowledge a son he'd wronged decades ago. Of course he did. And honestly, some quiet part of me even understood that instinct. The question was whether a man in a compromised, medicated, dying state, guided by the very person who stood to inherit everything, had truly made that decision with a clear mind, or whether he'd been led there, step by careful step, by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate grief, because manipulating emotion was his entire profession. I looked at my mother that night, still shattered from learning her own husband had used her therapy sessions as bait, and I made a decision. We weren't going to accept this quietly. We were going to fight for the truth, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The next morning, Daniel found something that made even Mr. Halloran go quiet on the phone. A wire transfer, dated 3 years ago, for $280,000, sent from a private account my father held separately from the winery's finances, straight to an account under Marcus Webb's name. Not a gift, not a loan on paper anywhere. Just a silent transfer, right around the exact time Marcus was supposedly still a stranger to our family, right around the time my mother's very first appointment with him was booked. I called the licensing board that handles psychologists in California that same afternoon, my hands actually shaking as I dialed. I explained everything: the undisclosed familial relationship, the years of counseling my mother without disclosure, the $250,000 payment from the very family he was treating, and the woman on the phone went very quiet before telling me this was one of the more serious ethics complaints she'd processed in years. Accepting money from a client's spouse, treating a client while concealing a blood relationship to that client's family, and standing to inherit directly from that same family, she said, were each individually enough to trigger an investigation. Together, they painted a picture of a man who hadn't stumbled into an inheritance. He'd engineered one. We hired our own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense estate litigator named Renata Cho, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, undue influence claims involving vulnerable, terminally ill people. She looked at the hospice notes, the wire transfer, the timeline discrepancies between what Marcus told me and what my mother remembered, and she told us something that finally gave me a reason to breathe again. This isn't just a weak will, she said, spreading the documents across her conference table. This is a textbook case. A vulnerable, medicated patient. A fiduciary relationship with the very person who benefits. Financial transfers that predate the supposed discovery of the relationship. Any judge in this state is going to take one look at this pattern and see exactly what it is. For the first time since that coffee cup hit the rug in my father's study, I felt something other than grief and rage. I felt the ground under my feet again. My mother, still working through the fact that the man she trusted with her most private fears had been quietly studying her for years, gripped my hand across Renata's table and asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything. What do we do now, Claire? I looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I actually knew the answer. What do we do now, Claire? My mother asked, and I finally knew. We filed the will contest within the week. Renata built the case around undue influence and breach of fiduciary duty, and filed a parallel complaint with the licensing board that same day. I won't drag you through months of legal detail, but I'll tell you how it ended, because it's the part I'm proudest of. Faced with a documented wire transfer that predated his so-called discovery, hospice records questioning my father's capacity, and an active ethics investigation that could end his career entirely, Marcus's attorney called Renata 6 weeks later, offering to settle before trial. Marcus withdrew his claim to the winery, the real estate, and the accounts entirely. In exchange, we dropped pursuit of the $280,000 and any criminal fraud claim, since proving intent would have taken years we didn't have. The licensing board pressed forward anyway. Marcus lost his license 8 months later, and no longer practices anywhere in this country. Whitfield Cellars is back in the family's hands, all 3 of us kids and my mother, exactly the way it should have been. My mother is in a new therapy practice now, one she personally verified had zero connection to anyone in our lives. She's healing, slowly, from the double betrayal of losing my father and discovering how thoroughly she'd been used at her most vulnerable. I think about my father a lot. And honestly, my feelings about him are still complicated. I understand the guilt he carried about a son he walked away from decades ago. I even understand wanting to make it right before he died. What I can't forgive is the way he did it, quietly, secretly, using my mother's pain as the entry point, and letting a manipulative man reshape our entire family's future while too sick and medicated to fully understand what he was signing. So here's my question for you, the one I promised at the start. Was I wrong to fight this? Wrong to drag my mother's therapist through an ethics investigation? To expose my own father's secret? To fight this hard for what was ours? Or was I exactly right to protect my family from a man who spent years quietly building a doorway into our lives? Tell me in the comments, am I in the wrong here? And if this story kept you hooked, subscribe, because trust me, this family has more stories worth telling.